how's it going? I want to talk more in depth about Pen Pal by Dathan Auerbach today. First things first, I really enjoy this book, but I think it's really hard to appreciate all of the good that this book has in it when it's structured the way that it is. While there are a few other problems that this book has in it, the issue that, if corrected, would massively improve the story told would be the way that the timeline is presented to us as readers. The foreword called Memories talks a bit how finding one memory can jumpstart the discovery of others, and that remembering your past can be very much like an archaeological dig. You can't be certain of the order that you pull things out. Now, of course, this story is meant to read like a depiction of real events, but even from that perspective, I feel like the author should still make it clear for us, even if for them remembering it was a bit difficult and out of order. They're writing a full story here. If they want to tell it to readers, they should make it clear for them. They can be artsy with it, but it has to be with purpose. It has to have a reason behind it. The original framing of this was him talking to his mom and then relaying the information and the memories that it kickstarted back to the readers of the subreddit, but this is a book, so I think it should have been reformatted a little bit to have better through lines throughout this story to make some of the more important parts hit home a bit harder than they do. And I'm not talking about adding anything. I legitimately think if you were to just reorder some of the events that we're told, it would make for a significantly better story. The best way of showcasing these problems is just by jumping in and telling you the story, so let's do it. We start with footsteps when the narrator is in first grade. He wakes up in the woods and initially puts this off to the fact that he's sleepwalked before and just assumes this is more of an extreme form of that sleepwalking he's done where he's woken up on the bottom bunk. But this logic quickly fails him when he realizes that he has no cuts or scrapes. After he gets lost and roams the woods for a little bit, he finally makes his way home to find both his mom and a police officer waiting for him. They thought he ran away because they found a note on his pillow. The final lines of this story do, however, reveal that the way that they spelled his name in that letter was not how he spells his name, and it goes to show that it probably wasn't him that wrote that. Super spooky, super chilling, A+. I really like this as a short story alone. I think it's really strong. I also want to highlight some of the language here, as I'm not going to have time to do it later as we go through this story, and I just want to get across how much I did enjoy reading this despite some of the confusion. There are uses of imagery, description, and metaphor throughout this book that really showcase just how strong Auerbach's writing skills are. This first chapter really flexes those abilities and gets across great tone from imagery and description. Now let's jump backwards to kindergarten for balloons. This chapter is the catalyst of all of the events of the rest of the story. His class has this lesson where they will tie notes to balloons and release them into the wild, and when someone finds it, they hope that they can then have a pen pal. The point of this is to teach community for the class, as well as help them strengthen their reading and writing skills. I think the premise of this lesson is really weird. As shown by this story, that balloon could go to someone significantly more sinister than I think the teachers are expecting, and that's kind of exactly what happens here. Everyone else in the class receives letters, and while the letters slowed down and ultimately stopped coming, everyone was receiving them except for the narrator. All he received was weird Polaroids that were kind of blurry and he couldn't really make out what was in any of them. By the end of the year, when the project is over, he ends up taking home 50 Polaroids. He doesn't think anything of it, he just thinks the person is weird. He tosses the Polaroids in a box and he forgets about it. Later, he and his friend Josh have a snow cone stand, and the dollar that he had put in his letter that said 4 stamps on it was returned to him. This immediately reminds him of his Polaroids, and he goes and takes a second look at them, and upon further inspection, he realizes that he's in every single one of them, even if it's just half of his face and the rest of the image is blurry. He's in all of these Polaroids. When he goes to show his mom is already in the midst of opening a letter with another Polaroid in it of the narrator and Josh from the day before. She immediately calls the cops because, as the last line of this chapter tells us, there was no postage on this letter, meaning that the person walked right up and put it in their mailbox. Immediately, I see a problem with the way that the first 2 chapters are structured. To me, I feel putting balloons first would create the first very significant and strong through line for the whole story, this pen pal. Without it, Footsteps feels really standalone. It's much harder to tie it to the rest of these stories. Because it being the very first chapter, it takes a lot more brain processing power, at least for me when I'm reading, to continually call back to that event. Because when I initially read it, I didn't have it in my brain that the events that were taking place were caused by something that we knew was going to happen. We had no idea of what was going on in the first one. He just kind of appeared in the forest, and there's no real concrete answer of anything happening. Was it supernatural, or was it just a guy who picked him up and then left him in the forest? But that opens up more questions of why did the pen pal just leave him in the woods? We would feel more fit to leave that story if it happened after we knew the pen pal existed, because then we would be looking for different things. We're not asking who did this, we already know that, and so we're asking better questions. The questions that I think this story wants us to ask, but because it's out of order, it doesn't really work as well. In chapter 3, Boxes, we get even more confusion to this timeline. Initially, it starts talking about kindergarten, and it explains the cast that was on the narrator's arm that was in balloons, which we didn't get an answer for in that chapter. It explains that because he was in a cast on his first day of kindergarten, his mom bought him this cat to cheer him up, which they named Boxes. We fast forward a little bit to where Boxes is run under their house, and when the mom goes down to see it, she comes out and something shook her down there. We don't know right now what she saw down there, but it really scared her. And while they were already planning on moving, she immediately had him grab what he could and get out of the house. We jump to the 5th grade, where the narrator and Josh are still good friends despite the narrator having moved away. The parents ended up chipping in to be able to buy these really good walkie-talkies so that they could talk at long distances, and one night in the 5th grade, when the narrator's staying over at Josh's, the narrator's mom tells him that Boxes has gone missing again. The narrator concludes that Boxes must have run into his old house because he was confused or something. The mom is really deceptive throughout the story, and so she actually doesn't tell him here that creepy stuff was happening under the house, and she lies to him and says that the people that are currently living there don't want anyone bothering them, so he and Josh sneak out to try and find Boxes without really telling anyone. They get to the house, and the narrator ends up going under the house like his mom did to look for Boxes. In the midst of this, they talk over their walkie-talkies, and we get some really good interaction between Josh and the narrator here. I really find some of this funny. It's like kids talking, but it seems like things that kids would actually say. While he is under the house, he's able to find a blanket and some dead animals as well as cat food tins, which he concludes was his mom trying to keep Boxes going under the house instead of running away when he was younger. When he talks to his mom about this, she denies this by saying she also saw those things under there and that's why they moved so quickly. Call the police. But this shows us the pen pal has never not been close to our narrator. Ultimately, Josh decides to go into the house to start looking for Boxes as well. And surprise, surprise, someone's in the abandoned house with him. This scene is definitely one of the higher points of tension in the whole story. There's a lot of fear that I felt as a reader while reading this scene. I mean, the narrator is right there under the floorboards as he hears Josh on the walkie-talkie just listening helplessly as his friend tries to escape. Josh is able to make it out of the house, and the narrator gets out from under the house, and they both start making a break for it over the fence, but Josh's walkie-talkie gets caught on the fence, and they just leave it and they keep running. Josh also screams that his photo was taken during this, a confirmation that this is in fact the pen pal who took this photo, because we've seen him take photos before. The next day, the narrator can hear the cries of his cat, and when he goes to look for them, he finds that they're coming from his own walkie-talkie. The timeline confusion here, I think, is stemming from Auerbach only giving us what we need for the current chapter, and not really creating setup for the story as a whole. Having put the broken arm story appropriately in balloons, as well as including getting Boxes, there would have been a bit more connection to that character and a bit more understanding as to why he wants to immediately run out and go looking for his cat. We spend more time with the cat, we see him spending more time with the cat, so we get a bit more connection through that. But instead, we're shown the MacGuffin at the beginning of the chapter, and by the end of the chapter, we're never going to see it again. Despite these problems, I think this chapter is the pinnacle of the terror and horror in this story. There's an immediacy to this danger, whereas a lot of the other chapters have more of a pervasive background dread that's just constantly following our narrator. We jump back again to the 1st grade for the next chapter, Maps. In this chapter, the narrator and Josh are trying to map out this lake and river that are in their neighborhood. While they're constantly in this lake, they're also interacting with their elderly neighbor that has Alzheimer's. At the end of the chapter, after they have a false alarm of being chased by a deer, and another sign of the pen pal making a return because the clothes that he left by the lake before he went swimming, now his shirt's missing and his pants have a drawing in them. After that, he has one weird interaction with his elderly neighbor, but then weeks later, men in hazmat suits take her out of the house in bags. That ending leaves a lot up for question. She was quite old, so it's hard to actually say what happened to her. We get a final line of realization from the narrator where when he had that weird interaction with her, he thought that she had said mom's home, and he panicked and he started running home before she would notice he was gone. But in fact, she had said Tom's home, the name of her late husband. So I think that the implication here is that the pen pal had actually stayed in her house and then ended up killing her, but it's really hard to draw that conclusion. I think it's very fair to say that she just was old and there was no one to look after her, so she died in the house and no one found her for weeks, so the body just decayed and they needed to take her out in bags. And I'm not sure if having that ambiguity here serves to do anything but muddy the waters more for the reader. Because of this, the chapter really feels like filler. All of the tension that comes from this chapter end up in false alarms, or the tension is being built by the fear of his mom, not by the crazy murder stalker pen pal guy. This chapter ultimately just serves as a big pacing issue that can be a letdown for readers, as well as just add more confusion to the timeline. I mean, this takes place after balloons, but before footsteps, and I guess Boxes is just around, but we don't even get a mention of the cat in the chapter. The next chapter, Screens, takes place when the narrator is in high school. We've jumped a significant amount of time since the last time we saw the narrator in 5th grade in the chapter Boxes, and so quite some time has passed, but the pen pal stalkers still be stalking. The narrator ends up running into Josh's older sister, Veronica, at the movies. Josh at this point has been out of the picture for a while, and later it's revealed by Veronica that he actually ran away. The narrator asks Veronica out on a date, and after they go on this date, he leaves her for a few seconds out in the parking lot, and she ends up getting run over by a car. He takes her to the hospital, and then after a few days, she texts him that he shouldn't come back because she doesn't like him seeing her like this. He accepts this and only converses with her through text, where they ultimately admit their feelings to each other, and he tries to get her to go out to the movies one more time. She says yes, but she doesn't show up, and in the chair that he saves for her, a man walks up and actually takes it despite him trying to say, hey, that's taken. When he gets home, his mom finally tells him that she actually died like a day after he took her to the hospital. I don't know why she didn't tell him before, but that's a different problem. The bigger problem is, who has he been texting? And that's when he gets a text message that says, see you again soon. Timeline-wise, it does a good job expressing that he's in high school. I actually very much like the interactions between him and Veronica here. It's not a great chapter for the tension or the spooky scaries, but it does raise the level of danger, showing that pen pal is 100% okay with killing people. This kind of serves the purpose that Maps tried to serve, but was ultimately unable to do. The final chapter, Friends, is probably the most mishmash of chapters in terms of timeline jumping. It tries to do a lot, and it bounces from place to place, but ultimately it just leads to a lot of confusion. It starts back in kindergarten, and it gives us the origin story of Josh and the narrator. It tells us how they became friends. And then it jumps to the narrator's 12th birthday, the last time that he will see Josh. At this birthday, Josh mentions that he thinks he's been sleepwalking right before he leaves for the last time, and this is obviously a hint that the pen pal has taken a liking for him. Before this, we've been given the suggestion that the narrator and Josh look alike, and the pen pal had taken his picture during boxes, so this is a pretty okay hook. It's pretty interesting to see this happen. But after this birthday scene, it jumps once more into the future, ahead to after the death of Veronica, when their dad, a construction worker, unearths a coffin on a dig site and finds the dead body of his own son. His body is beneath the body of who we can only deduce is the pen pal. We get a lot of exposition as to how we got to this point from Josh's dad, how he was approached by a man a few weeks ago, asking if he could fill in some holes on a site that Josh's dad already knew was going to have construction taking place on it a few weeks later. So he took it, and he ended up burying that coffin. We also deduce here that the pen pal wanted to lay in the coffin, and then Josh bit him and caused him to bleed out, but because he was so heavy, Josh was unable to get out of the coffin, and so ultimately he died completely awake, buried alive. We get a description of Josh's dead body here, where he's wearing the childhood clothes that he stole when they were in Maps, and his hair is dyed to more match the narrator's hair. So we can draw the conclusion that pen pal was able to fulfill his horrific dreams with Josh instead of our narrator. But having all three of these points in time stuck in the same chapter weakened two major points of the story, I feel. It weakens the 12-year-old Josh hinting about pen pal because we get the payoff immediately. There's no waiting, there's no, oh my god, what's gonna happen here? But ultimately, I think a bigger weakness to the story as a whole is splitting the chapters the way that Auerbach did. By keeping them as standalone stories that are throughout this timeline, it forces him to have these weird jumps around where he goes from kindergarten to 12 years old to 10th grade, and it doesn't really work too well. We lose a lot of the cohesion and the through lines of this story. The end ultimately feels a bit flat to me because I feel like a lot of what we needed for this to make sense is thrown at us in the last two chapters. I think this is definitely due to the origins of this story. It started as posts on Reddit. He didn't really know how it was going to end because he only planned on writing footsteps. And I think when it transformed into a book, he should have thought about reformatting it from standalone stories to a bit more of a flowing plot that doesn't have to be completely chronologically in order, but at least have purpose for why you're changing up the order. But it just sticks out so glaringly, and it honestly confused me. But I still think, despite all of this, Dathan Auerbach has some very strong writing skills, and the fear and tone that he has in these chapters is still really good. And if you can power through this timeline issue, I think you can actually find just how enjoyable this story is. I want more people to read this book. I want more people to enjoy this story because I think the underlying story is ultimately good. So there it is. Those are my thoughts on Pen Pal. I could talk for days about this book, but I could do that for every book that I read. And for these longer form things, I think I do want to pick a big glaring issue or something that I just love about it and dive in, because I don't want these videos to be 45 minutes. I do got some things I want to complain about in other books, and I do got books that I really hate. Don't get me wrong. I got some rants I got saved in my back pocket. I'll whip them out. It'll be great. Don't worry. I got those for a rainy day. Thank you so much for checking out this video. If you found it interesting, if you liked what I had to say, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and go down in the comments and tell me what story you feel gets a lot of flack, but you still enjoy no matter what. Thank you so much. Stay lit. Have a great day. Peace.